The papers were already printed, crisp, white, final. Marcus Hale had held them for 3 days, folding them, unfolding them, setting them on the kitchen counter only to pick them up again. 31 years of marriage, compressed into a legal document thin enough to slide under a door. His attorney, David Chen, had reviewed every clause. The settlement was fair. The division of assets, the retirement accounts, the house on Birchwood Lane where he and Claire had raised their 2 daughters, all of it laid out in careful columns, waiting for signatures. Marcus had read the document so many times, he could recite its language in his sleep. He was ready, or, at least, he believed he was. Then came a Tuesday afternoon, in late October, that rearranged everything he thought he knew about the woman he'd been married to since he was 23 years old. Before we go any further, if stories about marriages, hidden truths, and the moments that change everything speak to you, hit that like button and subscribe. We have a community here of people who understand that the most important relationships in our lives are also the most complicated. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because these stories come from everywhere, and so do the people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to the beginning, because to understand that Tuesday in October, you need to understand what the previous 2 years had done to Marcus and Claire Hale, and what it had done to both of them separately. Marcus was 54 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life as a structural engineer. He built things that lasted: bridges, parking structures, the bones of buildings that would stand long after he was gone. He was precise by nature and patient by practice, a man who believed that most problems had solutions, if you were willing to study them long enough. He was not a man given to drama. He did not raise his voice in arguments. He did not throw things or storm out of rooms. He communicated in measured sentences and expected the same in return, which had served him reasonably well in his professional life and had created, over 3 decades of marriage, a particular kind of silence that he had always mistaken for peace. Claire was 52, a landscape architect who worked primarily with residential clients in the affluent suburbs north of the city. She was warm where Marcus was reserved, expressive where he was contained, and for most of their marriage, this had seemed less like a fundamental incompatibility than a complementary balance. She softened his edges. He steadied her flights. Their daughters, Rebecca, now 27, and June, now 24, had grown up in a household that was calm and loving, and occasionally, in ways none of them would have named at the time, profoundly lonely. The fracture, when it became visible, had come in the form of a year Marcus preferred not to think about. The year he had thrown himself so completely into the Meridian Tower project, a 40-story commercial development in the city's financial district, that he had effectively disappeared from his own home while still sleeping in its beds and eating at its table. He had been present in body and absent in every way that mattered. He knew this. He had known it then, though knowing had not been sufficient to change it. Claire had asked for his attention in ways that were direct, and then less direct, and then not at all. And Marcus had interpreted her final silence as acceptance rather than surrender. By the time Meridian Tower was complete and Marcus surfaced from the project fog, something between them had calcified, not shattered. Calcified, grown rigid and cool and resistant to ordinary tools. They went to dinner. They attended Rebecca's graduate school. Graduation. They went on a trip to Portugal that both of them smiled through with clenched and careful joy. And then, 11 months ago, Claire had said quietly, over a Saturday morning breakfast, that she thought they should try counseling. And Marcus had agreed with a heaviness in his chest that told him he already knew what the counseling would ultimately conclude. Dr. Pamela Worth had a small practice on the 4th floor of a converted brownstone 12 minutes from their house. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair cut close to her head, and the quality of stillness that Marcus associated with surgeons and bomb disposal technicians, a deliberate, cultivated calm. He had liked her immediately. Claire had chosen her, which was typical of how their household had always functioned. Claire initiated, Marcus followed, with measured consent. He had not resented this. He had not examined it closely enough to know whether he resented it or not. For 8 months they had sat in Dr. Worth's office on alternating Tuesdays and Thursdays, together for the couple sessions, separately for the individual sessions that Dr. Worth had introduced 3 months in, saying it was useful for each person to have a space to speak without audience. Marcus had not objected. In his individual sessions, he had been honest in the careful, systematic way. He was honest about most things, identifying problems and their probable causes and suggesting structural solutions. He had acknowledged his failure during the Meridian year. He had described his difficulty with emotional vocabulary. He had, in one session that cost him something genuine, admitted that he was afraid he had spent so long building structures for other people that he had neglected to maintain the one he lived inside. Dr. Worth had listened. She had asked questions. She had offered no easy absolution, which Marcus had respected. What he had not known, what he could not have known, because nothing about Claire's behavior had suggested it, was the content of her individual sessions. That was the point of them, of course. Confidentiality. Private space. He had assumed Claire used hers the way he used his, to examine her own role in what had gone wrong, to identify patterns, to do the architecture of self-understanding. He had assumed this because it was what he would do, and because he had been making the fundamental error of assuming Claire for 31 years without ever fully accounting for the ways she was not him. The Tuesday in late October began without ceremony. Marcus arrived at Dr. Worth's brownstone at 2:45 for a 3 o'clock individual session. He took the stairs rather than the small elevator, a habit. The 4th-floor hallway was carpeted in a deep burgundy that swallowed footsteps, and there were 2 chairs outside Dr. Worth's office door for clients waiting, a standard arrangement. Marcus had sometimes arrived early enough to wait in those chairs, listening to the muffled, indistinct sound of voices from behind the heavy door, hearing nothing intelligible. On this Tuesday, however, something was different. The door was not fully latched, not open, not visibly ajar in any dramatic way, but the latch had not caught, and the door had drifted inward by perhaps 2 inches, enough to change the acoustics of the room entirely. Enough for a voice to pass clearly into the hallway. Claire's voice. She must have come early. Her session, Marcus understood later, had been scheduled for 2:15. She must have had things to say that required more time. He did not plan what happened next. He stood at the hallway entrance, his coat still on, his briefcase in his left hand, and he heard his wife speaking to their marriage counselor with a clarity and a tenderness and a devastating honesty that she had not, in 11 months of therapy, ever directed at him. "I know what people assume," Claire was saying. Her voice was low but unhurried. The voice of a woman who had been building towards something for a long time and had finally arrived. "They assume I'm angry at him. And sometimes I am. But mostly, what I feel is grief. Because Marcus is a good man. He is genuinely, fundamentally a good man. And I'm not sure he knows that about himself. And I'm not sure I ever told him clearly enough. And that is something I am going to carry for a very long time." Marcus did not move. "When I think about the Meridian year," Claire continued, "I don't think about what he took from me. I think about what he was doing to himself, and how he didn't even see it. He was running from something. He always runs by going deeper into work, not away from home, but so deep into the work that home becomes something abstract, a place his body returns to. And I watched it happen, and I kept thinking, if I just wait, if I just hold on, he'll come back. And he did come back. But I realized that I'd spent so many years waiting for him to come back from various projects, various pressures, various disappearances into his own mind, that I had run out of the particular kind of patience that waiting requires. I wasn't angry. I was empty. And I didn't know how to tell him that because Marcus fixes things. He is a fixer. And I couldn't tell him I was empty without him immediately trying to build a solution, and I didn't need a solution. I needed to be seen. There was a pause. Marcus heard Dr. Worth's voice, but could not make out the words, only the tone, which was gentle and inviting. He sits in here, Claire said, and her voice was almost wondering now. And he describes our marriage like an engineering project. He talks about load-bearing problems and structural failures. And I used to find that maddening. I used to think, can't you speak like a human being? But I've been sitting with it, and I think that's not distance. That's how he loves. He is trying to understand how to fix it, because fixing it is how he shows love. He's been trying to repair something that I had quietly decided was finished, and he didn't even know. He doesn't know. He still doesn't know. Doctor Worth, because every time I come close to telling him that I've already said goodbye in my own heart, I see the way he's trying, and another pause. Longer. I question everything, Claire finished quietly. That's the truth. I question everything, and I don't know what that means for us, and I haven't been honest with him about how far gone I actually was when we started this process. Marcus stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time and was probably 45 seconds. Then he walked back to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, and sat in his car in the small parking lot behind the brownstone for 22 minutes. He did not cry because he was not built for the easy release of tears. What he did instead was sit with the enormous and reorganizing fact of what he had just heard and let it do what it needed to do to the structures he had already built. He had heard something he was not meant to hear. He knew that. He also knew, with a certainty that operated below rational thoughts somewhere in the body, that what Claire had said in that room was the most honest thing spoken between them in years. She had not been speaking to him. She had been speaking to someone safe, and that was the real information. Not just what she had said, but the fact that she had been unable to say it to him, that he had been, for reasons he could not entirely blame her for, an unsafe audience for her truest feelings. His divorce papers were in his briefcase. He opened the briefcase and looked at them. Then he looked at his phone. Then he looked at nothing for a while. When he finally drove home, he did not call David Shen. He did not file anything. He made dinner instead pasta with a sauce from scratch, the kind that required an hour of patient reduction. And he set the table, and he waited. Claire came home at 6:15 with a careful blankness on her face that he now recognized as the face she wore after a session, wrung out, temporarily emptied, maintaining surface function through habit. She stopped in the kitchen doorway when she smelled the food. "You cooked," she said. "I had time this afternoon," Marcus said. He turned from the stove. He looked at her directly, not the glancing, surface-managed eye contact they had settled into, but the real-looking, the sustained, steady-looking, that he had somewhere along the way stopped doing. "How was your session?" "Fine," she said. Then, perhaps because of the way he was looking at her, she amended it. "Hard. It was a hard one." "I believe that," he said. They ate. They talked about June's new apartment and whether the neighborhood was safe enough and whether the building had adequate heat. They talked about Rebecca's research. They talked about the ordinary commerce of a family's ongoing life. And underneath every word, Marcus was thinking about load-bearing problems and structural failures and a woman who had needed to be seen and had not been. After dinner, he washed the dishes. Claire dried them. This was an old arrangement they had fallen back into, without discussion, a relic of the early years when they had no dishwasher and had stood at this same domestic task in a smaller apartment, learning each other's rhythms. He washed, she dried. For 20 minutes, they worked in a silence that was different from the calcified silence of recent years, warmer, more tentative, like the silence between people who have many things to say and are trying to find the right order. He did not tell her what he had overheard. Not that night. He needed to think. He needed to understand what it meant that he had heard it, and more importantly, what it meant that she had said it at all. There was something in the act of holding that information privately, not as a weapon, not as a secret advantage, but as a responsibility that felt important. He had been given, accidentally, a window into his wife's interior that she had never opened for him. The question was not what to do with the information. The question was why that window had never opened between them directly, and whether, even now, it could. That night, he did not sleep. He lay in the dark beside Claire's breathing form and thought about 31 years with the methodical attention he gave to any complex structure, and he began to see, for the first time, all the places he had allowed small failures to accumulate without repair. Not the dramatic failures, not the meridian year, which had been catastrophic enough that he could name and examine it. The smaller ones, the years of deflecting with logic when emotion was required. The years of solving when witnessing would have served the years of assuming that Claire's steadiness meant she needed nothing, when in fact it meant she had learned not to ask. He had not been a bad husband in the ways he had always checked for badness. He had not been absent in the obvious senses. He had been present physically, financially, parentally. He had loved her in every way he knew, to love which was the problem, because the map of love he carried was limited, and he had never fully understood that the territory was larger than his map. 3 days after the session he hadn't attended, Marcus called Dr. Worth's office and asked for an additional individual appointment. He was given a Thursday at 4. He came on time, rode the elevator, verified the latch on the door, and sat down across from the silver-haired woman who had been holding his marriage in her careful hands for 8 months. "I want to be honest with you about something," he said, "because I think honesty is the only useful currency left in my life right now." And he told her. He told her about arriving early, about the unlatched door, about standing in the burgundy hallway and hearing Claire speak. He told her not to protect himself, but because he believed Dr. Worth needed to know the context of what he was about to say. Then he said it. "I don't want to use what I heard against Claire. I'm not here for that. I'm here because what I heard told me something I should have known years ago, that my wife has been trying to show me something, and I have consistently failed to look in the right direction, and I want to understand why. I want to understand the mechanism of that failure well enough to actually change it, not just to describe it accurately." Dr. Worth was quiet for a long moment. "You understand. I can't speak to anything discussed in a client's individual session," she said. "I know," Marcus said. "I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to help me with me." There was a shift in her expression, small, subtle, the adjustment of something precise. "All right," she said. "Then let's talk about what you do when you're afraid of being insufficient." It was the right question. It was, possibly, the most accurate question anyone had asked him in years. And Marcus, who had spent his life engineering solutions to other people's structural problems, sat in a small office on a Thursday afternoon and began the slow and difficult work of understanding the structural problem that was himself. He did not file the divorce papers. He did not destroy them either. He put them in the bottom drawer of his desk at home, under a set of architectural drawings from a project he'd completed in 2019, buried them there, not as a hidden threat, not as a reminder, but because it felt important to acknowledge that the decision had not been made and that undecided things deserved a place to live without being constantly visible. He continued his sessions with Dr. Worth. He continued the joint sessions with Claire. But something had changed in how he came to those joint sessions, something that Claire noticed without being able to name, because the change was not in what he said, but in how he listened. He stopped formulating responses whilst she was speaking. He stopped cataloging points he wanted to address. He looked at her. He waited. He let what she said arrive before he decided what it meant. It took 3 weeks before Claire said something in a joint session that she had never said in a joint session before. She said, "I felt invisible, not past visible, not struggling to be seen, invisible. Already past it, past the point where even being unseen would require another person's attention. Already spectral in her own marriage." Marcus did not rush to correct this, to offer evidence to the contrary, to build the case that she had not been invisible, that he had seen her, that he had always seen her. He sat with the word. He let it be what it was. And then he said, "Tell me when that started." And she looked at him with an expression that he would not have been able to read a month earlier, but could read now as something between surprise and the loosening of a very old guard. And she told him about the Tuesday evenings in the early years of their marriage when he would come home and immediately open his laptop. She told him about Rebecca's 3rd birthday party when he had been there in body and completely elsewhere in mind. She told him about the Portugal trip, the one he had thought they'd survived successfully, and how she had stood on a hillside above Lisbon, looking at a view of breathtaking beauty, and looked over at him. And he had been looking at his phone. "Not even work," she said, "just your phone, just the habit of not being here." He remembered the hillside. He did not remember the phone. The not remembering was its own kind of information. "I'm sorry," he said. Not as a device, not as a conversational move, designed to signal proper contrition. He said it because he was. He said it with the specific gravity of a man who has finally located the exact weight of a thing he's been carrying without understanding what it was. Dr. Worth let the silence exist. She was very good at that. December arrived with a cold that came in off the lake and settled into the city like something permanent. Marcus and Claire were still in the same house, still sleeping in the same bed, though with the careful distance of people navigating unmarked territory. The divorce papers were still in the drawer. He thought about them sometimes, not with urgency, but with the awareness of someone who knows a decision has not yet been made. He was doing something different now, something small and concrete, and therefore comprehensible to him, in a way that larger emotional gestures were not. Every evening when he came home, before he opened his laptop, before he checked his phone, before he did anything else, he went and found Claire, in the kitchen, in her studio, in the garden, if it wasn't too cold, and he asked how her day had been. Not as a formality, he asked in the way he asked technical questions, at work with the posture of a person who actually wants to know the answer and is prepared to receive whatever the answer is. At first, Claire gave him the short answer, the social answer, the one calibrated for a husband asking out of habit, "Fine, busy. The Worthington project is behind schedule." And Marcus would say, "What's making it run behind?" And she would look at him slightly differently and answer the real question. And from the real question, they would find, occasionally, a real conversation. It was not a transformation. He needed to be honest about that. It was a repair. Slow, incomplete, requiring constant attention. The kind of repair that would never leave the seam invisible but might, if done carefully enough, leave the structure sound. In January, 6 weeks after the day in the hallway, Marcus came home to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and a look on her face that told him she had made a decision about something. Juan. He sat down across from her. He did not ask. He waited. She said, "I want to tell you something that I've been telling Dr. Worth, but haven't been able to tell you." His hands were still. He looked at her. "When we started therapy," she said, "I had already decided it was over. I went into that first session thinking that counseling was a formality, a kind of civilized way to confirm what I already knew, so that when I filed for divorce, I could say we tried everything." She paused, her hands wrapped around the cold mug. "I had already composed the speech I was going to give you. I had thought about which of us would keep the house, how we'd explain it to the girls, how we'd handle holidays. I was that far along. And I didn't tell you that. I let you believe we were coming into this as equals, both trying, and that wasn't honest. I wasn't honest with you, and you deserved to know what you were actually working with." Marcus looked at the tabletop for a moment. Then he looked back at her. "What changed?" he asked, not with suspicion, with genuine, careful curiosity. Claire took a slow breath. "You did," she said, "gradually, in ways I didn't expect and wasn't prepared for. Because you're not supposed to change, Marcus. That's not how the story was supposed to go. You were supposed to sit in those sessions and say all the right words and ultimately be the same. That's what I was waiting for, the confirmation that you couldn't actually do it. But you kept surprising me, and then you started coming home differently and listening differently, and I didn't know what to do with that. Because it complicated the goodbye you'd already said," Marcus said. She nodded. Her eyes were bright and careful. "Because it complicated everything." He reached across the table and put his hand on hers. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a reclamation or a declaration. Just the specific weight of one human hand on another. The most basic possible acknowledgement of shared territory. She didn't pull away. "I have something to tell you too," he said. And then he told her. About arriving early. About the unlatched door. About standing in the burgundy hallway and hearing her say that she questioned everything. He watched her face as he spoke, watched the color move in her cheeks, watched the initial flash of something like exposure or betrayal, watched it settle into something more complicated. When he finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "How long ago was that?" she asked. 6 weeks, he said. She processed this. He could see her doing it, could see for perhaps the first time the actual movement of her interior, the mechanics of her thinking, expressed in the small changes of her expression. "You heard that," she said slowly, "and then you came home and cooked pasta." "Yes, and you didn't say anything. I didn't know what to say. I needed to understand what it meant before I opened my mouth." She looked at him for a long moment. "That," she said, almost to herself, "is the most emotionally intelligent thing I've ever heard you describe doing." There was a disbelief in it, but not an unkind one. The kind of disbelief that is actually the beginning of revision. "I've been working on a different approach," he said. She almost laughed. Almost. The breath of it. The near thing. Then she turned her hand over beneath his and held it. It was not a resolution. He understood that it was not a resolution. There were months of work ahead, of sessions with Dr. Worth, of difficult conversations that would not always end with held hands and near laughter, of learning an entirely new vocabulary of attention that he had spent 54 years failing to acquire. The damage was real and the trust had been genuinely strained, and Claire's early decided goodbye had left its marks in places that wouldn't simply disappear, because they were now visible. But the paper stayed in the drawer. February brought a day when Marcus came home and Claire was in her studio, a converted sunroom off the back of the house, all glass and winter light, working on a design. Bent over her drafting table with the same fierce concentration that he recognized from himself in the office. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before she noticed him, and he saw something that 30 years of shared life had blunted into invisibility. She was extraordinary, precise and creative, and entirely absorbed. Her hand moving across the paper with a confidence that was its own kind of authority. He had lived alongside this person for 3 decades, and had somewhere along the way stopped seeing her. She looked up, found him looking. "What?" she said, half guarded, half curious. "Nothing," he said. "Just, you're good at what you do." She stared at him for a beat. "You've never said that to me." He considered this. It was probably true. He had thought it, had always known she was talented, had spoken of her work to colleagues with genuine pride, but he had never said it to her directly. "I know," he said. "I should have said it for 30 years. She turned back to her drafting table, but not before he saw the thing that moved across her face. Small, layered, not simple happiness, but something deeper and more structural, like a wall that has been under pressure for a very long time, and has finally, in one precise place, been relieved of it. March. The girls came home for a weekend. Rebecca from her university position, June from her apartment in the city. They sat around the table that Marcus and Claire had bought together 24 years ago, a solid oak table that had hosted every important meal of their family's life. And they ate and argued about movies and politics and whether June's new neighborhood really had the best noodle place in the city, which June maintained with passionate certainty and Rebecca disputed on principle. Marcus watched his daughters and his wife in the warm light of the dining room and felt for the first time in a very long time that he was actually present in the room he was occupying. Later that night, after the girls were settled, Claire found him in the kitchen, and she said, "You were here today." "Yes," he said. "The whole day," she said. "Not partly. I'm working on it," he said. "I haven't got it right yet." "But I'm working on it." She considered him. "I know," she said. Then quietly, "I'm not sure what I think about us yet. I want you to know that. I don't want you to think that things are decided." "They're not decided," he said. "But something is different," she said. "Something is different," he agreed. She nodded once and went to bed, and Marcus sat in the kitchen for a while with his coffee and the particular quality of uncertainty that is not the same as dread, the kind of uncertainty that exists when something is genuinely open, genuinely possible, genuinely unwritten. He was not comfortable with it. He had never been comfortable with the unresolved, but he was learning to sit inside it without immediately trying to build a structure to contain it. The divorce papers were still in the drawer. He was no longer sure what he was going to do with them. He was no longer sure that certainty in this matter was the right goal. In April, on an evening when the weather had finally turned and the windows in the house were open for the first time since autumn, Marcus opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out the document. He held it. All those carefully negotiated clauses, all that reasonable language for the end of something. He sat with it for a long time. Then he shredded it. Not because the marriage was saved. He was honest with himself about this. He did not traffic in false certainty. He shredded it because the version of his marriage that those papers described was a version he had compiled in despair, in the belief that nothing could change, in the certainty that he had already run out of chances. He had learned, through a fluke of an unlatched door and 22 minutes in a parking lot and a long, painful winter of actually trying, that certainty about living things was usually a form of cowardice dressed up as realism. Things could change, people could change, not completely, not permanently, without effort, not without the constant maintenance that any structure worth keeping requires. But they could change. He and Claire were still in counseling. That would continue for a long time yet, not as crisis management, but as ongoing maintenance, the way you inspect a bridge, not because you expect it to fail, but because the inspection itself is what keeps it sound. Claire had not said they were going to make it. He had not said it either. What they had said, in the language they were slowly and imperfectly building together, was that they were still here, still at the table, still doing the work. That was enough to work with. For a man who built structures for a living, Marcus Hale understood something fundamental. You never begin construction with a guarantee that the finished building will be perfect. You begin with sound materials, careful attention, and the willingness to keep showing up at the site. The rest is the work. And Marcus was learning at 54 that the most important structure he had ever been given the chance to build was not made of steel or concrete, or the precision calculations of load and stress. It was made of two people choosing repeatedly and imperfectly, and without the comfort of certainty, to remain within speaking distance of each other's truths. He put the shredded paper in the recycling. He went downstairs. Claire was in the living room reading, her feet tucked under her, in the corner of the couch that had always been her corner, her face turned toward the lamp, with that particular quality of absorption. He sat down at the other end of the couch. He picked up the book he'd been making slow progress through for 3 months. They read in silence, the new silence, The one with texture and warmth in it, the one that was not the absence of communication, but the presence of two people, comfortable enough to be quiet together and know the quiet meant something. Outside, the April wind moved through the trees on Birchwood Lane. The windows were open. The night came in. You know, there's something in Marcus and Claire's story that I think many of us recognize. The way we can share a life with someone for decades and still be fundamentally strangers to each other's interior world. The way silence can masquerade as peace, until one day a door doesn't latch all the way and the truth comes through. What Marcus heard in that hallway didn't save his marriage by itself. What saved it, or began to save it, because these things are never finished, was what he chose to do with what he heard. He didn't use it as ammunition. He used it as a mirror. He looked at what it showed him, and he decided to change the thing he saw. That choice is available to all of us. In the relationships that matter, if we're willing to make it before the papers are already signed. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know. Leave a comment and tell me. Have you ever overheard something you weren't supposed to hear that changed everything? Have you ever been the one who needed to be seen before you could find your way back? And if you're somewhere in the middle of a story like Marcus and Claire's, I hope tonight was a reminder that the middle isn't the end. Hit that like button if this one got to you. Subscribe if you want to stay in this conversation, and I'll see you in the next one.